यही जय राम हरे घनश्याम हरे जय राम हरे घनश्याम हरे। सब सुकृतों का आगार यही सब सुकृतों का आगार यही गंगा यमुना की धार यही गंगा यमुना की धार यही श्री रामेश्वर हरिद्वार यही श्री रामेश्वर हरिद्वार यही जय राम हरे घनश्याम हरे जय राम हरे घनश्याम हरे। रे मन प्रति सांस पुकार यही जय राम हरे घनश्याम हरे। तन नौका का पतवार यही जय राम हरे घनश्याम हरे जय राम हरे घनश्याम हरे। ॐ पूर्णमदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। हरिः ॐ श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः। हरिः ॐ। ॐ सदाशिवसमारम्भाम् शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्ताम् वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम्। श्रुतिस्मृतिपुराणानाम् आलयं करुणालयम् नमामि भगवत्पादं शङ्करं लोकशङ्करम्। शङ्करं शङ्कराचार्यं केशवं बादरायणम् सूत्रभाष्यकृतौ वन्दे भगवन्तौ पुनः पुनः। ईश्वरो गुरुरात्मेति मूर्तिभेदविभागिने व्योमवद्व्याप्तदेहाय दक्षिणामूर्तये नमः। ॐ सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। तव नाम स्मरणं मम जीवनम् तव नाम श्रवणं परमानन्दम्। तव नाम स्मरणं मम जीवनं तव नाम श्रवणं परमानन्दम्। तव रूपग्रहणं भवहरणं तव रूपग्रहणं भवहरणं तव पादसेवनं मम रक्षकम्। तव पादसेवनं मम रक्षकम्। त्वं हि मनोहरणं सच्चिदानन्द त्वं हि मनोहरणं सच्चिदानन्द त्वं हि मनोहरणं चिन्मयानन्द त्वं हि मनोहरणं चिन्मयानन्द त्वं हि मनोहरणं सच्चिदानन्द त्वं हि मनोहरणं सच्चिदानन्द सच्चिदानन्द चिन्मयानन्द सच्चिदानन्द चिन्मयानन्द। तव नाम स्मरणं मम जीवनं तव नाम श्रवणं परमानन्दम्। ॐ गुरुनाथ जय गुरुनाथ 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 ॐ गुरुनाथ जय गुरुनाथ। हरि को हर में देखा साधो हरि को हर में देखा, हरि को हर में देखा, हरि को हर में देखा। आप माल और आप खजाना, खजाना आप खर्चन वाला। आप माल और आप खजाना आप खर्चन वाला। आप गली में भिक्षा मांगे, आप गली में भिक्षा मांगे, हाथ में लेके प्याला। साधो हरि को हर में देखा, हरि को हर में देखा, हरि को हर में देखा। आप नैना आप शैना, आप नैना आप शैना, आप कंबल काला। आप नैना आप शैना, आप कंबल काला। आप गोद में आप खिलावे, आप गोद में आप खिलावे, आप मोहन बाला। साधो हरि को हर में देखा, हरि को हर में देखा, हरि को हर में देखा। ठाकुर द्वार
ॐ सहनाववतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। हरिः ॐ। Offering my pranams at the feet of Holy Trio, and with pranams to revered Swamijis assembled in the hall, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. As a part of our ongoing year-long centenary celebrations, we are fortunate and very happy to have amongst us today a distinguished guest, Professor Francis Xavier Clooney. I would request revered Swami Satyadevanandji Maharaj, the Adhyaksha of the Ramakrishna Mutt and Secretary of Ramakrishna Mission Mumbai, to extend a welcome to Professor Clooney by offering him a flower bouquet. A round of applause, please. Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you, Revered Maharaj. An introduction to Professor Francis Clooney. He has joined the Harvard University Divinity School faculty in 2005, where he is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology. After earning his doctorate in South Asian Languages and Civilizations from University of Chicago in 1984, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center of the Study of World Religions at Harvard. His primary areas of Indological scholarship are theological commentarial writings in Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. He is also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. He has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, on the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation, and on the dynamics of dialogue and interreligious learning in the contemporary world. Professor Clooney is the author of numerous articles and books, including Thinking Ritually, Retrieving the Purva Mimamsa of Jaimini, published by Vienna in 1990, Theology After Vedanta, an experiment in comparative theology, published by State University of New York Press in 1993, Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders, published by Wiley and Blackwell in 2010, and His Hiding Place is Darkness, a Hindu Catholic Theopoetics of Divine Absence, published by Stanford University Press in 2013. His translations of the Hindu theologian Ramanuja's Manual of Daily Worship, Nityagrantham, appeared in the International Journal of Hindu Studies in 2020. His most recent books include Reading the Hindu and Christian Classics, Why and How It Matters, published by University of Virginia Press, 2019. Western Jesuit Scholars in India, Tracing Their Paths, Reassessing Their Goals, published by Brill in 2020. And most recently, Saint Joseph in South India, Poetry, Mission and Theology in Costanzo, Giuseppe Bestis, Tempavani, published by Vienna, 2022. He is currently finishing a memoir, Priest and Scholar, Catholic and Hindu, a love story, and working on a translation of the first 4 Alvars, Vaishnava poet saints of Tamil Nadu. In July 2010, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and has served as a Professional Research Fellow at the Australian Catholic University. His most recent honorary doctorate was awarded in November 2019 by Regis College, University of Toronto. During 2022-23, he was the President of the Catholic Theologian Society of America. Apart from this introduction, which is very academic, he had been a close associate with the monks of Ramakrishna order, starting from Swami Sarvagatananda at Boston. He is very close friend of Swami Tyagananji Maharaj, Swami Sarvapriyananji Maharaj. With Tyagananji Maharaj, he has worked. Tyagananji Maharaj also, who happened to be a visiting faculty at Harvard University. And Professor Clooney, he is, as he himself told us, his journey and association with the Ramakrishna order started with a book, The Great Master, which he found in a old used bookshop, and that he started reading, and thus he came in contact with the Ramakrishna order, upon which he wrote some article, and Swami Sarvagatananda from Boston Center had contacted him. He had also delivered talks at various places and written numerous articles, books published in our journal and outside, published books, etc. through and done some research work at Golpark Institute of Culture. Also on Swamiji's 150th birth anniversary celebration, he was one of the keynote speakers. So I once again I convey my thanks and welcome to Professor Clooney, and hands it over to him. Please once again a big round of applause for Professor Clooney. Thank you, sir. You can speak. You want to be here? That is standing up. So I will pull it here. Okay. It's stand up. Okay. Okay. Namaskaram. So thank you, Swami, for introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight and be with you. It is a pleasure for me to come to the center so soon after your 100th, your centenary anniversary. A few weeks ago, Swami Tyagananda, as you say, is my good friend, and he mentioned that he came here in April. And he also mentioned that this was the mutt that he entered the order way back when he was a young monk as well. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. I should begin with just several other comments. First, I was wandering through the bookstore this afternoon, looking at the books. And it's always one of my great pleasures with the Ramakrishna order is to see so many publications in different languages, but teaching Vedanta and also wonderfully teaching the history of the Ramakrishna order. Who were the Swamis? Who were the lay disciples? Who were the people who worked in the beginning with Sri Ramakrishna and Guruji, Swamiji? All of this is so wonderfully put there in the bookstore. And so many religious groups don't have bookstores. And I think it's a wonderful tribute to the intellectual side of the spiritual nature of the mutt that you have the bookstore. Then after my lunch today, I had a lovely lunch, came out and met a young couple outside the church, the monastery, the hall where Sri Ramakrishna is honored. And the young couple, speaking Bengali, I don't speak Bengali, but a little English, mentioned that the husband had been very sick with cancer. And after treatments here, has come back a number of years for checkups. And now it seems after 5 years, he's okay. So he's been, in a sense, healed from his cancer. And I said, why didn't you go to some hospital in Calcutta? Because he said, here, this hospital with the monks and the Ramakrishna order is the best. And I think it's wonderful work that you reach out, healthcare, caring for people in need with all kinds of diseases. Because the spiritual by itself is wonderful, but also healing people is also a great thing. So it's wonderful to see the multiple works of the order. Is this okay? No, okay. So as Swami said, I began to learn about the Ramakrishna tradition by reading the Great Master. I don't read Bengali, but I read it in English. When Swami Chaitanananda was doing the new translation of it, I helped him with the English, but I couldn't help with the Bengali. And I've always found it to be inspiring to think about the life of Sri Ramakrishna, to think about who he is, what kind of person he is, and how his life communicates his spirituality. And what I would like to share with you in my remarks tonight, which will not go too long, would be to share some of the scenes from the life of Sri Ramakrishna that have meant the most to me, that have told me what kind of person I think he is, and why for me as a Christian, he is such a remarkable figure who speaks of spirituality, of truth, of the way to see God, of liberation, transformation, and how I find in him a good example of the way we all should be, I think, in this day and age. We should be able to learn interreligiously from the great saints and teachers of other religious traditions other than our own. And for me, Sri Ramakrishna is always in the first rank. He's one of the most important for me. So I'll just have a number of scenes, and I think you will all, especially the Swamis in front, but many of you know these scenes very well. And I don't believe that I'll be telling you anything that you don't know already, but at least hearing it from me with my American accent will sound a little different this time. And I hope I'm speaking clearly even in American. So
give it my best. So one of the first scenes that came to my mind was when Ramakrishna was a young boy still. And I'm always interested, as we all are, I think, in how children develop and what is the unique opportunities in the life of a child that will predict something of what they will be later in life. And this is a famous scene that is related in the Great Master. Sometimes the boy would lose himself completely and enter the unknown, distant, and solitary domain of the spirit. The experience we now relate also had its origin in the boy's tendency toward the spiritual contemplation of beauty. One day, while roaming carefree in the fields, Gadadhar looked up to the sky and saw a newly formed dark cloud, and against it the rhythmic motion of a flock of cranes in full flight with their snow-white wings outspread. So just seeing the dark cloud with the white cranes flying by had a spiritual meaning for him because it was so beautiful. And it says the boy became so completely absorbed in the beauty of it all that his awareness of his own body and of all earthly things disappeared altogether, and he fell down unconscious. And it goes on to talk about how they were worried. They carried him back from the field. He regained consciousness and seemed to be okay. But they said this is unusual because boys aren't usually like this, but something he saw that changed him. When he talked about it, he told them again and again that what had happened to him was really due to his merging in a feeling he had never experienced before. That although he found outwardly unconscious, deep down he was conscious inwardly and had experienced a unique bliss. So outside, his body consciousness collapsed and he fell down on the ground. But inside, his consciousness was complete and full. And he actually was in a state of bliss. And I think this ability that he had from the start, in a simple scene in nature, seeing the cranes in the dark cloud, provoking this letting go of the external body, and having this inner bliss is such a beautiful experience, predicting, I think, the kind of person that he would be later in life as well. In another passage, later in the Great Master, he talks about it again. He said it was the month of Jyeshta, or Ashar. One part of the sky there appeared a black, beautiful cloud charged with rain. I was looking at it while eating the rice that he had in his hand, some dry rice. Very soon the cloud covered almost the whole sky, and a flock of milk-white cranes flew against that black cloud. And he says more fully, it was so beautiful that I became very soon absorbed in an extraordinary mood. I fell down, the rice was scattered all over the ground. People came and carried me home. This was the first time I lost external consciousness in ecstasy. And knowing, as you do, the life of Ramakrishna, many times he went into ecstasy. He was singing and suddenly he would be transformed. Or he'd be talking to somebody and somebody sometimes would be in ecstasy. Later in his life, he could communicate this ecstasy to other people simply by touching them or by looking at them. But even as a child, he had this extraordinary possibility, which in some ways reminds me of someone like Jesus in my own tradition, who seemed to have spiritual experiences even as a child, and that beauty to see in the young person all that will come later. So that was the beginning. The second scene comes a little bit later, when Sri Ramakrishna is already at the temple. He's already been asked in Dakshineshwar to be a priest in the temple. And unlike many of the priests in temples then and now, or in churches then or now, he really wanted to have a deep experience of Kali, of his mother. He didn't want to simply go through the motions, rattle off some Sanskrit mantras, and then go and have his breakfast. But he wanted to have an experience. And you all know this scene where he comes to the edge of desperation. I'll read you part of it only. We were told by the Master himself that one day at the time when the ritual was happening, he was singing for the Divine Mother and very eagerly prayed and wept to have her vision. He prayed to her saying, "Dost not thou, O Mother, hear even a little of the many prayers I say to you? Thou showest yourself to Ram Prasad, why should you not show yourself to me?" And he goes on to talk about the anguish in his heart and how his heart was like being squeezed, like a sponge, and the life being squeezed out of it. I felt that I might never have the vision of the mother, and I was dying of despair. Being in an agony, I thought that there was no use in my living anymore. My eyes suddenly fell upon the sword that was there in the mother's temple. I made up my mind to put an end to my life at that very moment. Like one mad, I ran and caught hold of the sword, and obviously he was going to cut himself. But as I grabbed onto the sword, suddenly I had a wonderful vision of the mother, and I fell down unconscious. I did not know what happened then in the external world, how that day and the next day slipped by, but in my heart of hearts there was flowing a current of bliss, never experienced before, and I have immediate vision of the light that was the mother. He says that later on, he talks about it one more time. It was as if all the houses and doors and temples and all the people and everything suddenly disappeared. It was as if there was nothing anywhere. All I saw was a boundless, infinite, conscious sea of light. However far and in whatever direction I looked, I saw a continuous succession of effulgent waves coming forward, raging and storming from all sides with very great speed. And I think this is interesting because in some ways it's like his early experience when he sees the cranes flying in the sky and falls unconscious. But now he's sort of reaching the high point of the mother herself, wanting to see her, not settling for less, and somehow then entering this blissful light experience. And again, I think he's one of the great masters, obviously, of human history, who is able to have this experience. What did he actually see? Did he see the face of the mother? It seemed that he entered into the light of the mother, and everywhere around him was this ocean of light. And I think it's a beautiful thing, and also it's a terrible thing when a young person thinks of taking their life. And perhaps some of you may know people who took their lives. And it's a terrible, sad thing. But it does speak with Sri Ramakrishna that he was so serious about wanting to have experience, he would not settle for less. Would he actually have cut himself with the sword? We don't know. But the grace of the mother, as he describes it, gave him a sense of finding what he wanted. The sword was thrown down like the rice was thrown down in the field, and he began to see the mother directly. In that sense, what do we say when you and I say we want to see God? Or I've seen God in my prayer, or I've seen God in my meditation. What do we actually mean? Do we care about it as much as Sri Ramakrishna did? Would we go to desperate ends to see God? And I think that's a challenge in my Christian tradition as well as here as well. There's a famous scene later, and I think you all know this, from Swami Vivekananda. He writes a beautiful essay called My Master. And he's talking about the first time that he met Sri Ramakrishna. And I think, again, you know better than I can't explain this very well to you, but that Vivekananda, in his life before he meets Ramakrishna, is an intelligent person. He has gone through school, he's educated, and like many young intellectuals in Calcutta in that day, he's debating everything. Is the spiritual real? Is there only material reality? Should you be a skeptic? Should you say only what you can see with your eyes matters? And he says that he went to different teachers and asking people, and all of them start talking in circles, and they say various things about things, and maybe he talks to the priest in the church as well. And he's not satisfied because they're all just talking. And then finally he comes to see Sri Ramakrishna. I heard of this man, and finally I went to hear him. He looked just like any ordinary man. There was nothing remarkable about him. So there was no light shining out. He didn't look taller than everyone else. He wasn't stronger than everyone else. He just looked like an ordinary person. He used the most simple language. And I said, how can this be a great teacher? He was expecting words that he didn't understand, but it was all simple. So I crept near to him, and I asked him the question that I had been asking others all my life. Do you believe in God, sir? And he answered, yes. Well, can you prove it? And of course, this is the great intellectual question. You talk about God, but can you prove that God exists? Can you prove there is a God? And he expected Ramakrishna to start saying all kinds of other things that were irrelevant. But as you know, Ramakrishna says to him, yes, I know that God exists, I can prove it to you. And he asks, well, how can you prove it? And he says, famously, simply, because I see him just as I see you here, only in a more intense sense. And that I think is quite wonderful, because usually we say, I can see you, you can see me, you can touch the person next to you, and then somehow we have this intangible sense of the divine. And it's less clear, less palpable. You can't really feel it directly. But Sri Ramakrishna is saying the opposite. And I think this has to do with the kind of person he was, that when he sees you and me, he does, and he cares much for many people. But at a deeper level, what he is saying is, my most direct, best, deepest experience is the experience of God. And that I see God, Vivekananda, young man, I see God more clearly than I see you, more immediately. And the Swamiji, the future Swamiji says, this impressed me at once. For the first time I found a man who dared to say that he saw God, that religion was a reality to be felt, to be sensed in an infinitely more intense way than we sense the world around us. I began then to go to that man day after day after day. I actually saw that religion could be explained and given from one person to another. And I'll come back to this later. One touch, one glance can change a whole person's life. And again, in my Christian faith, in the Gospels, there are so many scenes where Jesus is just walking by and he says, come follow me. And suddenly somebody's life is changed completely. Or the woman who was sick for 18 years with a bleeding disease. She comes up behind Jesus and touches just his garment. And suddenly she's cured. And I think that sense that resonates with me is that Sri Ramakrishna was like that too. His greatest disciple, who would become Swami Vivekananda, was one of those people who suddenly, this ordinary-looking man who doesn't seem to be great, he's not educated, suddenly this is the man who changes my life. And I think that power that Ramakrishna had to do that has always struck me as very, very basic. And when we influence people, you and me, what is it? Is it our fine words? Is it our studies? Is it the books we've written? What is it that matters most? It has to be some kind of God experience, would be the deepest thing of all. Next scene is a little bit more complicated, but again, you may know it better than me. So when he was having these experiences and beginning to live in the presence of the mother, this vivid sense of God, people around him were saying, it's probably a delusion. You can't really live that way in this world. So Haladari, I think, worked at the temple. He was an associate of Ramakrishna. He was there, and he's skeptical, saying, you're making too much of it. This doesn't really work. And you're just an ordinary person like the rest of us, so stop talking in this way. And maybe Haladari was just trying to provoke him, to get him to say something interesting. But I think he also represents the skeptic in society. Somebody calls themselves a saint, but they're not really a saint. And so it goes on this way, and he's very upset by these words of Haladari, who's skeptical, and doesn't know what to say. So there are a number of scenes in the Great Master where Ramakrishna says, I'm not an intellectual, I'm not a great scholar, I don't know what to say when people come to me with their skepticism and so on. But he says then that he, confused by Haladari's scholarship, he ran to the Universal Mother to ask her what to do, which is quite beautiful. He goes to his mother and says, what shall I do? What shall I do? One day, we are told, he proved that the divine experiences in ecstasy were Haladari was proving that the experiences of God in ecstasy were untrue, that God was beyond existence and non-existence. So Haladari is like giving a discourse, why God cannot be experienced. And then Ramakrishna says, he hears this, he runs to the mother, and at first I thought that all the experiences I had of the mother, all the experiences I had in Bhava Samadhi were just a delusion. I was worried that maybe the mother had been deceiving me. Extremely anxious, I cried out with a feeling of wounded love, and I said to Mother, "Should you, Mother, deceive me because I am an unlettered, simple person?" The cry and agony would not stop. I sat there and I wept. But then suddenly, after some time, a fog-like smoke was rising from the floor and filling the space in front of me. I saw later in that smoke a beautiful face with a golden complexion. And the face has a beard, so it's not the mother, but it's some kind of a male figure with a beard. That figure looked at me and said with a profound voice, "My child, you are to remain in Bhava Mukha," the state of Bhava Mukha. And repeated these words 3 times and dissolved in the fog, and the fog vanished. And then I got back my peace of mind. Later on, the Master described this event to Swami, the man who would become Swami Premananda. The Master said this about the doubt, about worrying, about crying out to the mother. I cried and pressed Mother importunately for a solution to the problem. She appeared to me, so now it's she appears to me, near the worship jar in the guise of a woman, Rati's mother, and says, "Remain in Bhava Mukha." And later on, when Totapuri, the traveling Vedanta teacher, the Advaitin, came to left Dakshineshwar after giving Vedanta to Ramakrishna, the Master dwelt in the Nirvikalpa plane of consciousness for 6 months. And yet he always heard in his heart of hearts at the end of that period the voice of the mother, "Remain in Bhava Mukha." Now, many of the Swamis here and others could explain this at length, what exactly is Bhava Mukha. But as far as I understand it, it's this sort of state of being in transcendent experience, beyond the world, totally in the divine consciousness, and yet still in the world. So somebody who's like taken off, they're not a normal person, they have this God consciousness, they've seen God, and yet the message and the mission given to them is remain here. Don't die. Don't go to a cave. Don't go simply inside and never come out again. But be in the world, because your state is to have the divine consciousness and be in the world. And for whatever reason, I'm not entirely clear, but Bhava Mukha seems to be the state of being in a higher consciousness and in the world at the same time. Now, I like this because it makes sense with my own Catholic spirituality, my own Jesuit spirituality. So our founder was St. Ignatius Loyola. There are many Loyola schools in India and elsewhere. And Loyola was tempted as a young man when he had his spiritual conversion to simply go and live in a cave and said, "I'll never come out. I'll just live in the cave and I'll experience God and that will be it." But what he realized was God saying to him, and he didn't have the same experience as Sri Ramakrishna, but he had experience, that God was saying, "Get up, leave the cave, go back into the world, because you have this God consciousness so that you can be in the world and help other people." And is it possible? This is what the great saints say. You can have this higher consciousness and be in the world at the same time. So you're not either or. You're either gone or here, but you have this consciousness and you remain in the world. And he goes on to talk about how everything was different. Sometimes he lost control and he was like laughing or dancing. Sometimes he'd fall down unconscious because he was being overwhelmed by God experience. But then other times he could simply sit there and talk to anyone who came in, help anyone who came in, because the Bhava Mukha experience gave him the ability to speak to people and help them. And he comes back to this later, it comes back again in the Great Master. After he had a full direct experience of the nature of the Divine Mother as a combination of Nirguna and Saguna, so instead of arguing about is Brahman Saguna or Nirguna, yes, both. You go back and forth between the two. The Master had the command, remain in Bhava Mukha. That is, and he explains it, do not remain in the Nirguna state by completely merging of I-ness, but live your life and do good for other people, living in constant, full, direct knowledge of the fact that you are nothing but the limitless I, from which all kinds of ideas in the universe spring, and that your desires and actions verily fulfill their desires in action. And this remarkable state, which I think we see some of only the greatest spiritual masters anywhere in the world, is to again have this consciousness and then go about your daily work. And I would like to think, I mentioned at the beginning, the bookstore and the medical treatment and the medical hospital. How is it possible that you as swamis, doing the work, having the spiritual life that you have, can do such practical work for people who are sick and help the doctors and help the nurses and so on? Seems to be very much what Sri Ramakrishna was talking about. Or Jesuit fathers, my order, I'm going tomorrow to St. Xavier's. How is it that the fathers who are also kind of monastics are running one of the best colleges, St. Xavier's College? The ability to be spiritual and to be in the world. And I suspect for many of you it's the same way, that we are spiritual beings, but we're called to be in the world. This reminds me of a scene, I'll skip ahead to near the end of the life of Sri Ramakrishna, where he is dying of cancer. As you all know, he seemed to die of throat cancer. And this terrible suffering affecting his voice, pain, swallowing food, all of this. And the problem you read in the Great Master in the later chapters, and I think in the Gospel also, is people saying, how can you, Sri Ramakrishna, the Great One, how could you have cancer? Why would Mother let you have cancer? Basically saying, you are so transcendent, you are so supernatural, you are so spiritual, you would be spared cancer. You would not have cancer. And he tries to explain to people what is going on, and he says this. Once, when people ask me, how can you have cancer? He said, the Divine Mother has shown me that people are getting rid of their sins by touching my feet. I am absorbing the results of their sinful actions, so I am suffering from this cancer because I am absorbing their sins. This is vicarious atonement. Jesus Christ suffered this way in his life. So in a way saying it's spiritual suffering for the sake of other people. That the cancer was somehow the physical manifestation in his voice, with which he would sing and speak and help people, of absorbing the sin of all people around him. And that's quite beautiful, but it was real cancer. It wasn't fake cancer or make-believe cancer. It was real cancer. The Master helped people. This is also in the Great Master. When he was suffering from the excruciating pain of cancer, every day he would still wait for seekers of God to come. He didn't go to his room and lie down and say, I can't do this anymore. In fact, it says, sometimes he would look out into the street and say, what happened? Why is nobody coming? And I think he felt his destiny, as long as he was alive, was to be spiritual but in the world, and take the gifts he had received and help as many people as possible, even while he had his cancer. I have a couple more scenes before I finish. There are fascinating scenes in the Great Master of him dealing with scholars who come from Calcutta. One is named Shashadhar, and Shashadhar is a learned doctor, a learned teacher who comes to see him. And as in other scenes, when these pundits come, Ramakrishna again is very nervous, saying, I'm an illiterate man, I can barely talk, I can't read properly, I don't know anything, and these big fellows are coming from the city. What can I say to them? And I think he feels he cannot do it. And of course the inspiration for any of us is you can do it. That even if you don't have the education of the other person in front of you, you can be the person who has the spiritual message. And there are a number of scenes where he talks to different people who come to him who have great learning, great pundits, even famous figures like Keshav Chandra Sen and so on come to see him. And he changes their lives. So in this beautiful scene, Shashadhar comes to see him, and he seems to be a good man. He's not coming arrogant. He's not coming to, say, you be quiet and I will give you a discourse. He's coming in trouble, and he says to Ramakrishna, so Ramakrishna looks at him, and Ramakrishna addresses the pundit and says, you are a pundit, please say something. So you get started, you start giving the discourse, you're the pundit, you're supposed to be able to talk. And Shashadhar said what he didn't expect him to say, sir, my heart has dried up because of my study of philosophy. So think of that, my heart has dried up because of my study of philosophy. I need your help. I have come to you in order to have a little bit of the sap of devotion. So please say something yourself, and then let me listen to you. So this was a great surprise, I think, turning things around, saying, yes, I am the great teacher, I'm the great scholar, I've done this and I've done that, but my heart is dried up. And you, the simple man here in Dakshineshwar, you are the one I know can help me. So just as Swami Vivekananda early on said, this is the man who has seen God, now Shashidhar says, you are the one who can help me, whose heart has been dried up. And so he addresses, he stands up, he becomes excited, it says he stands up and he says this to Shashidhar, until the mind is joined with existence, knowledge, bliss, Satchit Ananda, both prayer to God and worldly duties must continue. As the mind merges in God, then one can let go of duties, but not before. So this doesn't seem to help. It's just another idea that he has. But he says, remarkably, he takes a song, and he takes up a song that in English reads, my Nitai is a mad elephant. And I don't know Bengali, but I looked up the words, Nitai Amar Matahati. Is that good enough? Good enough. And he begins to sing this song to Shashidhar. And he says that if you sing this properly as a kirtan, the words are sung first with correct enunciation, tone, time, measure, tempo, rhythm. And as you sing, you should pay attention to all of this. So if you're going to sing something in Bengali, a kirtan, you should do it right. Don't be lazy, don't be sloppy, but do it in the right way. Afterwards, as your mind begins to merge a little in the emotion of the song, so as you understand what you're singing, it becomes simpler. So then the words mad elephant, I guess that's matahati, those words come to the fore, and he starts simply to repeat those words to Shashidhar. So he's simplifying it. Only those words are sung. But then as the mind enters more deeply into the emotion, then only the word elephant is sung. Hati, 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 hati. And finally, as the singer goes deep, then all the singer can say is ha, ha, ha. And the thing about this that's so interesting is that he doesn't give some quote from the Shastras, he doesn't give something from some great thinker, some pundit in order to impress the pundit, but he sings a very simple verse. And in singing it, he shows what he means by singing. You sing the whole verse, then you sing less of it, less of it, less of it, until you have this kind of bija mantra, ha, ha, ha. And what good does this do for Shashidhar? Ramakrishna does this, speaking no sooner than the master had uttered the syllable ha, then he himself, Ramakrishna, became completely speechless and motionless and remained in that state for 15 minutes, bereft of any external consciousness, his face bright and serene. So he loses consciousness, he sings and he goes into this state. And poor Shashidhar is left there, like, hey, what do I do now? So then he turns to Shashidhar and says, how did it go? Did that help? And he says to Pandit, oh Pandit, I have seen you through and through. You are a good man. He gives the example after finishing cooking, a housewife places her towel on her shoulder. She goes to the pond to bathe and wash her clothes. She doesn't go back to the kitchen. She's finished. It's all done. So to you, O Pandit, you will finish telling others and you will never go back where you were before. And hearing these words of the Master, Shashidhar says, it is all through your grace. And he took the dust of his feet again and again. So he goes down humbly and touches the feet of the Master. He heard the Master's words quite astonished, and his heart melted into tears. As he had so long thought that he could never realize God, suddenly the tears came out. So how did Ramakrishna change Shashidhar? He didn't do it again by Purva Paksha Siddhanta. He didn't do it by reading Brahma Sutras and other things that you might do if you're trying to impress a pundit, but he simply sang the verse and went into his own samadhi. And suddenly, Shashidhar found that his heart was no longer dry and that he was softened up. And I wouldn't say this would always work. It probably doesn't always work. But somehow he knew what Shashidhar needed was somehow the mad elephant becoming the simple ha sound. And he goes into that state. And he realizes that he could understand. This is explained another way later on. Shashadhar, I guess, says, Ramakrishna says, I didn't actually know what I was saying to him. So he sort of loses consciousness. He intuits what Shashadhar needs. When a little consciousness returned, I saw that he, the pundit, was weeping. He had completely changed. And he sort of goes on to say, I was amazed by that. I mean, how is it that I, by singing this verse and going into samadhi, could suddenly have this great pundit weeping and touching my feet? That seems to be part of the beauty of the scene, that he wasn't calculating. He didn't have like a 3-step plan or a 5-step plan or a 10-step plan, but he did what he thought the moment required. And again, I see in my Christian tradition, Jesus was like that too. Some people he'll treat by simply touching them. Other people he'll test, like Peter saying, get out of the boat and walk on the water. Some people he'll let them die and then bring them back to life. And that Ramakrishna seemed to know what to do with individuals. And there are other scenes, I won't go into them, in the Great Master, where he knows exactly how to deal with simple people, with housewives and doctors and children, and he knows what to do when a pundit walks in. And that's the remarkable skill he has of being able to change things, which again, for the tradition, and again, the tradition, all of you and the monks here in the front, the Swamis, the tradition of the past 100+ years since Sri Ramakrishna is this mix of the spiritual, the intellectual, contemplation, action, being in the world but not in the world. And all of that seems to come from the experience of Ramakrishna himself. And that great teachers like Swamiji, Vivekananda, are simply kind of putting into words what he found in the Master. And I think that's very beautiful. 2 more scenes and then I will be done. Near the end of his life, in January of 1866, the Master is, beginning to die. Dr. Sarkar and others cannot figure out what to do. The cancer is getting worse. He's losing himself. And it says that Ramakrishna had to spend much of the day in bed, and he wasn't able to come down. But there's one day in January, it says in the first day of January, 1886, the Master felt well that day, so he desired to come out of his room and take a walk in the garden. And apparently every day people would gather in the garden. Devotees would come of all different levels in case the Master came out. And if he didn't come out, they'd come back the next day, and the next day, and the next day. So this day, he does come out into the garden. It was a holiday, and the householder devotees came one by one and in groups shortly after midday. He came downstairs at 3 p.m, and there were at least 30 people there in the garden, talking, discussing with one another. And suddenly, when they saw him, they all got up in reverence and bowed down before him. He came down into the garden path, through the western door of the hall on the ground floor, and he was slowly walking into the garden. And he saw the disciples there, Girish and Ram and Atul and others. They saw him and they saluted him. They came joyfully to him. And then he begins to change them immediately. So he says, Girish, all of a sudden, before anyone has spoken, Girish, you, I say, say to one and all, say to one and all the things that have been said about me, that you have seen me and you understand who I am. Girish stands there unmoved, then kneeling down on the ground near the Master's feet, in a choked voice, with his hands folded, his face turned up, he says, what more can I say of him, whose greatness Vyasa and Valmiki could not find words to express? So he has this expression of faith from Girish. The Master was charmed at this fervent utterance of Girish, and blessed all the devotees assembled there through their representative Girish. So he now extends, maybe he extends his hands, I don't know, that's what often is done. What more shall I say to you? May you all be blessed with spiritual awakening. And suddenly at this moment, everyone in the garden, he says, all of you, be filled with spiritual awakening. Beside himself with love and compassion for the devotees, hardly has he said these few words when he himself went into ecstasy, Bhava Samadhi. So again, he began to lose consciousness as he's done, but the words of blessing, untouched by any tinge of selfishness, directly entered the devotees' hearts with a raised high billows of bliss. It's like they were all kind of caught into the ocean that Sri Ramakrishna was in when he went into the ocean of the bliss of the mother early in his life. And it says they forgot time and space. They forgot the disease of the master. They forgot their previous determination not to touch him until he recovered. They were aware that out of sympathy for them and their plight, this divine being, though he experienced excruciating pain at their mystery, though his heart was overflowing with compassion, had come down to them, called them to himself, gave them protection, like a mother sheltering her children against the dangers around them. They became eager to bow down before him and take dust of his feet. They ran around the courtyard saying, "Victory, Jaya Ramakrishna," saluting him one after another. And it says that this scene seemed to then fill them with the same ecstasy that he had. They began to lose consciousness. They were filled with grace and compassion. Each of them was touched in a special way in the mood they wanted. Their joy knew no bounds at the act of the Master. They felt that nothing was held back from them. Suddenly everything was revealed. They had not the slightest doubt that everyone, the sinner, the afflicted, the dying, could find refuge at his feet. Unable to utter words at this wonderful occurrence, some were only looking at the Master, as if they were under a spell. Others cried out to all in the house to come and be blessed by the Master. Others collected flowers and worshipped him, and they all went into ecstasy because the Master had given them the blessing. Now this reminds me, again, the Christian, of the scene of Pentecost. So after Jesus has risen from the dead, the disciples, men and women, are gathered in the upper room. And they're praying and wondering, Jesus has gone back to heaven. We have many enemies around us. What will happen next? And suddenly the sky was opened and the Spirit of God came down upon them. It says like tongues of fire. And each one of them had this like sense of the fire entering into them. And it says they all began to speak boldly in different languages. And all the languages of the world they began to speak. They went out in the streets and they were proclaiming the glory of God. When I read this scene from the great Master, I think of that scene, how the power of God comes down and changes people from timid, frightened, weak people into people who can speak and do good works in God's name. And I think that's remarkable because, again, Sri Ramakrishna was not simply saying, I had special experiences, I am a special person, but I give everyone my blessings. And I think as I believe with Jesus over the centuries, so too now, that's why we are here, I suppose. Sri Ramakrishna's blessings are for everyone, even today. But the last scene is a very well-known one, and I probably don't have to read much of it. So after all his basic sadhanas were finished, Sri Ramakrishna was interested, well, what about Buddhism? What about Islam? And you all know this. What about the Christians? What do the Christians believe? And so he had one of his devotees read to him from the Gospel. He had a picture, a famous picture, you've all seen it, of Madonna, Mary with the baby Jesus. And he had one of his disciples reading to him from the Gospel. One of those pictures was the picture of Jesus in his mother's lap. The Master used to say that he sat in the parlor and was looking intently at that picture and thinking of the extraordinary life of Jesus, when he felt that the picture came to life, and effulgent rays of light coming out of the bodies of the mother and child entered his heart and radically changed every idea in his mind. So I think this is a beautiful point, is that he was the great Master. He was deeply rooted in Vedanta, other sadhanas. He was the child of Kali, his mother. But when it came to reading about Jesus, seeing Jesus, he didn't run the other way. He didn't say, I can't do that. But he said he allowed the light from Jesus to come into his life. And I think that's a sign that we strive for, particularly in today's world, where there's so much animosity and so much kind of fear, people against one another religiously. Be like Sri Ramakrishna and not be afraid of learning from the other. And so he began to have visions in ecstasy, as it says here. All the so-called Hindu ideas in his mind were pushed to one side. He began to see Jesus in the church. He began to see the mother of Jesus. And he had this sense of being filled with a Christian experience for a time. And then famously at the end of it, and you all know this, when the third day of this experience was about to close, he was walking in the Panchavati, the garden, when a marvelous godlike man of fair complexion came walking toward him, looking steadfastly at him. When the master saw that person, he saw that he was a foreigner. He saw his long eyes, the beauty of his face, the tip of his nose, though a little flat, didn't impair his beauty. When that person came near to him, from the bottom of the master's heart came out a singing sound, a ringing sound, the words, Jesus, Jesus the Christ, Jesus the great yogi, Jesus the Son of God, Jesus one with the Father, who gave his heart's blood and put up with endless torture in order to deliver people from sorrow and misery. And Jesus the God-man then embraced the master and disappeared into his body, and the master went into ecstasy, losing normal consciousness and remaining identified with Brahman, with attributes, Saguna Brahman. Having attained this vision of Jesus, he became free from doubt about Jesus being an incarnation of God. And again, I close with this scene because I think in some ways, again, it's a beautiful tribute to Sri Ramakrishna that he could have not only read something about the Bible or something about the priests or something about Christianity, but he wanted direct, immediate experience. He wanted to cross over and meet Jesus. So early on, he wanted to meet the mother. He wanted to see the mother. He had these experiences. He said, now I want to meet Jesus. And according to his own description, the two came, Jesus embraced him, and they merged into one another. And I think, well, we can't all do that in the 21st century. We can't simply say, I will meet the Prophet Muhammad, or I will meet Sri Ramakrishna, or I'll meet Shankaracharya, or I'll meet Vivekananda, or I'll meet any of the prophets. There's something here that we're challenged to, that if we stay timidly in our own tradition and say, I can go so far, but that's the end of it, we should be reminded by Sri Ramakrishna, you can go further. You can open your heart, you can open your mind in your prayer, in your meditation. Don't be afraid if the other religions come in. They can become part of who you are in your own faith tradition. And this, I think, is one of the basic points I started learning of Sri Ramakrishna when I found the book in the bookstore, The Great Master. I still have the original used copy that I had. When I found that book some 40 years ago, he began to show me how can you, as a Christian, learn from Hindu tradition. Don't be afraid. Don't think you're going to lose your faith. Keep your eyes open and realize that as you experience God in your own tradition, now you experience God in the other tradition as well. And I think all we can do is be thankful for the great Master who has come in our midst and whose memory we celebrate now, and also pray that we in our time and place in 2023, 2024, 2025, be like him, be like Jesus, and find ways to cross the boundaries and show that we all belong together. So let us pray for that. Thank you.
We were hearing Professor Francis so nicely talking about Sri Ramakrishna, his life, the message, teaching the students, and also doing it as his spiritual sadhana. So it was wonderful listening to Professor. We are very thankful. Also, I express our gratitude and respect to Professor Francis on behalf of Ramakrishna Mission, Mumbai, especially on behalf of our Swamiji, Swami Satyadevananji, and all the other monks. Also on behalf of all the devotees gathered here, I express our love and respect to Professor Francis. We wish him all the best and success in his spiritual endeavors. Thank you and all. Namaskar.
I have a question. Now that you have you basically are a Christian, now that you have gone through Ramakrishna and the Hindu philosophy, what is your thinking on rebirth?
Someone asked me this the other day as well. What about rebirth, karma, punarjanma? How does this work? I think at some level, what I have learned over the years is, on the one hand, to say that certain things are simply very different in our different traditions. There are different ways of saying things, different ways of thinking about human life, that it's not natural, it's very uncommon for a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim to talk about rebirth, reincarnation. So I think that's one aspect. I'm being honest with you. We think of ourselves as having been born, one life, death and eternal life. Then we believe we live on forever. But I think, if this was like 1850 or 1875, I then would start to bash reincarnation and say, this is the 10 reasons why it's wrong, the 10 reasons why it's not possible. And I think what I've learned over the years is this is a different belief rooted in Indian soil. And I can learn from it by thinking maybe I don't understand the mystery of the beginning and the end of life. That while I can't, as a Catholic priest, get up and say, I believe in reincarnation, to say, I begin to think, what does it mean to be conceived? What does it mean to be born? What happened before? And then what happens after death? I think I try to have a more open mind, that even though this is a different teaching, I won't attack it, I won't criticize it, and say I need to listen to it and learn from it, even though I think it's not very easily compatible with Christian faith. Is that okay?
Thank you.
No, thank you. Please.
Ramakrishna said, the Discourse-Prof he says on doing meditation so that we get to, a state where we understand our conversation itself. So, you have read so many religions. So, what is the, how better to get into, see now, when we read the history of Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna, we understand that he had gone to that level. But as an amateur, if we want to, at least travel on that path. So, how do you see, from all the religions?
So I think this is a beautiful question. As I understand it, that as you're saying, that we all are amateurs. We're all beginners. We try our meditation. We try to keep a spiritual life. But we may not have the deep experience of someone like Sri Ramakrishna. And we may feel we'll never get there either. And so the great saints, the great figures in history, they have the great spiritual experience, but not you and me. I suspect that on one level it's realistic to say that. It's honest. One of the reasons I started with that passage is before Ramakrishna did any sadhana, any preparation, out in nature it says he's transformed by beauty. And he just sees the cranes against the black cloud and he's transformed. And that kind of losing consciousness he then had all his life. He was that kind of child, that he already had spiritual experiences when he was 6 years old. And I think many of us have probably had the same thing. But I think he probably would say, and if you read, and I'm sure you've read, the great master in the gospel, so many people of so many different backgrounds came to see him. And I think so many of them saying, oh, Master, all I can do is touch your feet. And he would say, but you are the child of the mother. You are the one who's called to be transformed. And so many of the people, like the last scene I read, he's in the garden, he says, may you all have spiritual consciousness. That no one is such an amateur that they can't have this consciousness. Again, I'm speaking also in terms of the Bible, that none of us Christians are going to be Jesus. or be Mother Mary. But I think the point of Jesus was to say, you can be free. You can change your life. You can be a disciple. So I think on the one hand, we have to be, as you say, humble, saying, I can't do it. Just like the doctor came to see Ramakrishna and said, my heart is dried up, nothing to be done. And Ramakrishna just sings him a song, simple, 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 and then suddenly he's weeping tears. If we think of ourselves as amateurs, we shouldn't think of ourselves only as amateurs, but rather every day we can be a little bit more conscious and spiritual than we were the day before, I think. Yeah.
How do you do? And these two terminology, one is prophet and one avatar.
Yeah. So so how do we look at the language of prophet and avatar? And I think that's interesting because one of the Christian teaching is that Jesus came once only. But even he says that God has spoken through the prophets again and again. When the people were losing their faith, when the religion was going down in Israel, prophets would come in order to revive people. So it's interesting to think that that's actually more like avatar than, we always say avatar and incarnation. And there's a special reason why Christians believe Jesus came only once. But the idea that God spoke through the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through Joseph, through Moses, through Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, John the Baptist. Again and again, when the country was running down, God would come and basically call on an ordinary person and say, you have my word. Beautiful scene, the prophet Amos. There's a little book of Amos in the Hebrew Bible where God comes to Amos and said, you should speak to the people. And Amos says, I don't know how to speak. I'm just a gardener. I take care of the vineyard. And God said, it doesn't matter. I'm telling you, you can do it. Or when God calls Moses to set the people free, Moses says, I can't even speak properly. Maybe he has a stutter. And God says, it doesn't matter. I tell you, you can do it. So I think that idea that there are individuals who speak to the needs of the time. I don't know, in terms of asking that question, would you say that Sri Ramakrishna was an avatar and not a prophet, or both?
I asked the expression about these two terminologies, what you understand.
And that's what I'm explaining to you. So I'm asking you if you think Sri Ramakrishna is both a prophet and an avatar?
If you consider the prophet is God himself, then
Okay.
there is no
Yeah,
difference between
yeah,
God
yeah.
and
So it depends in part then on terminology, because in the Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, Muslim tradition, our prophet has the word of God but is not God. And the avatar is, and you have Purna avatar, the full avatar. So it would then end up being fairly different, except on the level that I was starting with, that when the world is in trouble, it needs God's presence, or it needs the word. And sometimes it's through the prophet, and then, as in Bhagavad Gita and Life of Ramakrishna, through the coming of God into the world. So I think it's a good question, but it might take longer to discuss.
what is your conclusion?
And I'm giving you my conclusion by telling you it's a complicated question. That depending on what we mean by words like avatar, incarnation, prophet, they could mean the same thing, or they could mean something very different. So I'm not hiding anything from you. I'm just saying that it's complicated. And depending on what you mean by these words, and what do I mean by these words? Well, I gave you at the start what I thought. Prophets come when they're needed. Avatars seem to come when they're needed. So on one level, they seem very much alike. But, yeah, stop there.
Can I ask? So I started taking, I hope my voice is audible. I started taking like interest in religious scriptures like since 2019. So there were some problems in my life, but at that time there was energy. So I was trying to understand various scriptures from Ramakrishna mission, other Raman Maharishi, even some Taoist, Lao Tzu and all those concepts. So there was energy initially, and I tried my best to logically understand those scriptures. And even I have tried formal meditations, but even after 4 years, that faith in like logically I try to understand, but that strength or faith that good things are possible, it's not getting generated for some reason within. So even in 4.5 years nearly, logically something clicks in the mind, but that strong faith for some reason it doesn't get, even like in my personal case, it has not got generated. Like great things, or when you look at the world, the objective world, then you feel that there is so many this world nowadays.
Right.
It's kind of in a messed up state, or like the bad guys are more winning. That kind of feeling comes. That strong faith, for some reason, it doesn't get generated. So I would like to know, like, why? I am trying my best to generate faith, but it doesn't get generated.
Yeah.
Please frame your question properly. Okay, we cannot go on narrating, right? So, sir, you have heard him. So, kindly express yourself what you would like to tell him.
So thank you for speaking, and we could talk more afterwards if you want. But I think on one level, it takes a long time. If you realize the world is in trouble, there are many dangers in the world today, many problems around us in all different countries. And you see that it's not conducive to spiritual advancement. There are so many things that are against the spiritual. It may also be that, as you say, you're trying to read the different scriptures and read this one and this one and this one. Maybe you're trying to do too much. Sri Ramakrishna did one sadhana after another. And he did, Vaishnava sadhana, then he did the tantric with the Bhairavi, he did the tantric sadhanas and so on like that. Maybe if you narrow it down, as he did with Christianity. So he had the Madonna, he meditated on it, he had a man read to him the gospel, and I think he stayed with it for a while with just one tradition and allowed that patiently to work and open up his consciousness. So perhaps you have to try, if what you're doing is not working, try another way, and talk to one of the swamis perhaps about a better path that would work for you. But I wouldn't give up. The worst thing would be to give up and say it's not going to happen. Because I think God wants all of us to be spiritually enlightened. And there has to be a way for you. You're a young person. You may have to spend another year or two looking around.
So, as someone who has done a lot of study comparing different religions, could you touch upon the karma theory as we find in, say, Buddhism or even in Hinduism, and whether it's there in Abrahamic religions or whether it is completely absent, the theory of karma or kamma, as they say in Buddhism? That is my first question.
So karma. And you don't mean simply rebirth. Okay. I think you can see this in the Bible, a very strong sense that your good deeds and your bad deeds will come back on your head. And that people who do good, they'll be rewarded, as Jesus says, 100-fold. So for the good you do, 100-fold generosity, love will come to you. And also that people who are evil and do terrible things, it says all your sins will come back on your head. And sometimes it's frightening, it says, and on your children and your grandchildren, it will come back again and again. So I think there's a sense in the Bible, and I think therefore Jewish as well as Christian, that karma is real. Karma makes a difference, and we accumulate bad karma, good karma, that make a difference in our life, and also make a difference in our world. So if people are doing evil, it doesn't just affect them, it can ruin society. People can ruin politics, people can ruin healthcare, all kinds of problems can take place, and therefore the bad karma spreads out among the community, even if I don't know the bad fellow, the bad karma can spread. And I think, the first story in the Bible is about Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve seem to be, they disobey God. They eat from the tree. And God says, you're out of the garden. You'll have to suffer for a living. All the world is now slightly ruined because of you. And that seems to be bad karma, like through human history. So I think there's common ground. The other piece of common ground, and I don't know the Buddhists that much, is to say that good karma does not save you. Good karma is better than bad karma, and you can do good deeds, but you can't do enough good deeds to be infinitely conscious. You need some kind of grace. And the grace of God, the grace of mercy of God, the vision of the mother, say eventually all my deeds, good and bad, throw them away, the burdens, and allow the good to come. And I think that's an awareness that I think we could all have, is that karma is real. If you think about rebirth, then you get into questions about, rebirth, and that's different for Christians and Jews and Muslims. But the fact that the karma lives on, but that karma, good or bad, isn't the end of the story. It's divine grace that changes us.
Okay, then we will end this session here. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clooney.
Thank you.